G'day everyone, it's Ben and Adila. Thanks for joining us, and as always, we appreciate your support, so thank you. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please do reach out to us via email or slide into our DMs.
This week we have a guest for you all, and he is from the social sciences field of study, and he's a UWA PhD student in his third year, and his research focuses on interviewing students with dyslexia to find out how that has impacted their schooling and their studying experience, their social class, and how that informs education policy as well. He also interviews their parents to find out how that has been an impact on them as well. Please put your hands together for Mr. Thom Neville.
Hey, hi everyone.
Hi Thom, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
We'll hear more about Thom in a sec.
Hi Thom, thanks for making time to join us today. We'll start off by asking a few questions, getting to know you a bit better.
Yeah.
So would you like to tell us a bit about your background, cultural, education, and what got you to where you are today?
Yeah, no worries. So I grew up in Mount Macedon, which is a small town, probably like an hour and a half out of Melbourne. It's probably primary school of, say, 100 students. And then when I was in year 6, I moved to Western Australia and started high school. So there's this actually kind of this strange thing where I was held back in pre-primary, right?
Oh, okay.
But when I went here, because we have different age levels in Western Australia compared to Victoria, I was too old to be in the year that I was supposed to be. So I went from being in year 5 to being in year 7.
Whoa!
So it was this big jump. And then obviously back then,
That is a big jump.
it wasn't high school yet. So it was still only the last year of primary school. But that was kind of a funny one. So I like to think of myself as one of the only people who have been held back and also moved forward for a year of their schooling. So
I didn't realise that you could keep students back in pre-primary as well.
Yeah, I know.
That seems a bit strange.
It's a funny one.
Especially because, I don't know if it's the same in Victoria, but pre-primary actually isn't... No, sorry, kindy isn't compulsory, but pre-primary is compulsory.
Yeah, it's compulsory. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. That actually happened to me back when I was first in Malaysia, and then I moved over to Australia, but I don't know if that's because my English was quite good, so I actually jumped a year as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but interesting.
Yeah, so that was interesting. And then, I went to high school here, and then I started my undergrad, and I went into anthropology and sociology, and I was also doing Indigenous studies as my other major. So that was at UWA. Yep. So all the way through UWA, I had some issues with selecting my units though. So I accidentally didn't select enough Indigenous studies units. So they're like, oh, well, you'll have to keep on doing it for another 6 months if you want to finish your major. I was like, oh no, I want to do honours next year. So I had to drop Indigenous studies. So be careful of selecting units if you're listening.
Yeah, that sounds tricky. So Thom, for our listeners, and to be honest for myself, if we don't know too much about anthropology and social sciences, correct me if I'm wrong, anthropology is the study of humans?
Yeah, so it's a very broad study of humans. So it could be study of social processes, study of people, study of culture. A lot of, like, when you think about traditional anthropology, it's more, some white guy going into a different country, studying the local people. So that's not the only thing that anthropologists and sociologists do. I'm more in the field of sociology of education. So that's understanding education, understanding the impact of things like education policy, social class, and how that shapes people's educational experiences.
That sounds right up my alley, actually. So that explains some of the Indigenous studies as well. So with those units, were you focusing on various types of Indigenous people all over the world, or?
It was more Western Australian Indigenous people. So understanding their culture, different worldviews, how, differences in how we perceive time, as well as colonialism. So looking at the impact of colonialism and how it still impacts people today.
So interesting.
And then we also looked at American Indigenous populations too, and understanding about that and how there's similar experiences with colonialism, but also some of the ways in which it's different. Yeah.
Right. Wow. And so you mentioned you did honours. Tell us a bit about honours.
So with my honours, I interviewed 2 young women who had recently gone through their education and were at university themselves, and they were both dyslexic. And just to define dyslexia for some of the people who might not understand what it is, it's typically defined as a neurological disorder that impacts people's ability to learn key things like reading, spelling, and sometimes writing. It's also linked to like a phonological defect, so understanding sounds and being able to interpret sounds and then read them. So it has a main impact during, primary school when you're learning those key literacy skills. So those two young women were dyslexic, and I interviewed them once for about an hour and a half, and they gave me like the full narrative of their schooling and asked them questions about parental support and all those sorts of things. And from interviewing those two young women, I got some interesting findings about, the lack of understanding of dyslexia in schools and some of the ways in which that can really damage people's self-esteem, particularly early in primary school, and as well as leading into high school if teachers still don't understand it. But there was an interesting, contrast between the two participants, because one, really struggled all throughout their schooling, but then the other participant was quite, high achiever, was able to go really well in school, but because of that, she was almost punished because she wasn't provided with the sorts of adjustments later in her schooling, which would have helped her succeed more in her exams. So things like extra time, and we can get into that a little bit more later in the podcast, I reckon.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think more and more now we're realizing how much of an impact something like dyslexia can have on children as they grow up, whereas perhaps back in the day or a few years ago, people would have just thought they were a little bit slower than everyone else, or there wasn't that same support. Would you? Yeah,
definitely. Pretty bad in the past. Things like, as you said, understandings of it, just thinking that people are slow and putting them into remedial classes. You can hear that with some of the parents that I've talked to about their own experiences in schools. Yeah. Teachers kind of giving up on them, the education system giving up on them, and then leaving school earlier than they probably should have. But you look at discussions in the 70s and they raise very similar issues to things that we're looking at today, like lack of training, teachers don't understand that, different understandings of dyslexia and definitions of dyslexia are being used in policies as well as between different groups. Right. Like different organisations. So similar issues now than they were in the 70s, I think.
So even up to this date, people are still having trouble classifying, dyslexia or diagnosing dyslexia?
Yeah, well, there's been changes over the years with the terminology that's used. So dyslexia is kind of not carrying favour anymore in the psychological community, I guess. Yeah. They use reading disorder.
Okay.
So specific learning disorder in reading, something like that. So that's used by a psychologist, but it's not really used by the people on the ground,
No.
Kids aren't saying I've got a reading disorder, they're saying they're dyslexic, or all the organisations, it's not dyslexia. Dyslexia spelled's the main one here. It's not called dyslexia reading disorder or something like that. It's called dyslexia spelled. So different terms are used, but dyslexia is still the main one. But there's a lot of confusion about it. Is it neurologically based? They use brain scans, all that kind of stuff to try to figure it out. So it's pretty contentious.
Yeah. And is there links to it being genetic or environmental, or can it,
Yeah, well, there is genetic
components,
aspects to it, definitely. Because you get families where, the mum and the dad was dyslexic and then two of the kids, like with my family, me, my brother are dyslexic. And then also both my brothers are also dyspraxia, have dyspraxia. So.
And is that different to
dyslexia? That's more like learning how to speak. So when you're young, learning how to talk. So a lot of delays in speech.
So dyslexia is used as an umbrella term, but within dyslexia you could have...
Well,
Or is it...
People like to think about it like it's autism, right? So it's a spectrum.
Right.
So some people have more severe difficulties than others.
Okay.
But again, that's pretty difficult to determine if that's because that kid got better teaching. So the difficulties aren't as severe as if they didn't have great teaching, or if they were getting interventions when they were younger, or if they just have more severe dyslexia or not. Yeah. So it's quite... it's complicated.
Yeah, no, thanks for answering some of these questions. I think I have a lot to learn as well about, dyslexia and things that are going on in this field. So bear with me as I ask you these strange questions. So that was honours, and then you did that project. And then what happened after that?
Well, whilst I was finishing off my honours, I handed in my application to do a PhD. So I hadn't even got my marks back yet. I was actually still finishing my final unit. Anyone who's done honours knows it's a bit of a nightmare, because you're writing your thesis, then you're doing like 2 units at the same time, and you're doing 2 units at the same time, so it's pretty tricky. But whilst I was doing that, I handed in my application for my PhD, and that got accepted around December, so probably just before my graduation.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Massive news.
Yeah,
So-
but why, Tom, did you want to do a PhD?
Oh, why did I want to do my PhD?
Yeah.
Well, I think that I wanted to continue on with this topic because I thought it was really important that more research is done on it. Most of the research that's about dyslexia is from the psychological fields. There's hardly any studies, say 4 in Australia, that have taken the qualitative approach and interviewed students and parents.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was reading these government reports, when I was doing my honours and seeing the issues that these parents were encountering and really negative impacts on mental health and academic achievement, you realise that this is a really big equity issue in the education system, and more people need to do research about it, and making the decision to do it by publication, which means that you're writing papers throughout and you're trying to get them published. I thought that doing it in that way I would contribute to the small body of researchers on it. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it. Another one was that I remember when I was a kid, my dad was doing his PhD. So I remember going and doing field work with him, and he was doing it on conservation genetics. So we were going all around the high country in Victoria, cutting holes in trees and getting tissue samples and going to pubs and eating hamburgers. Is this what a PhD is? It's pretty fun. So I had a pretty positive experience of higher education when I was a kid, and I thought, this is something that I could definitely do and enjoy.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And are you enjoying, 3 years in now, or just about starting your third year, are you enjoying this process? Of course, there are going to be struggles.
There's ups and downs with it. I think that it's quite stressful doing your PhD, particularly by a publication, because you're trying to get those papers in, you're responding to reviewers, you get rejections, and then you have to send it to someone else. I've definitely really enjoyed the interview process and hearing people's experiences and getting an insight into that. I think that's the most enjoyable part of the project, particularly when you're listening to it and you're thinking this is not being talked about in the research before. This is going to make a positive contribution and hopefully make some impact on policy and the like. So that part of it's been good. The part of writing it, having to deal with theory, catching up on reading, trying to get your argument really clear, that can be quite hard. And particularly with your PhD, it doesn't really stop. You have to keep on going with it. I don't know, you can feel like you're running out of time, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. I think
that's why most people get their extension of extra 6 months, and I'll probably take that, get some more money from UWA and keep going for another 6 months just to get some papers published and finish it off. But it's been good, but it's hard, but it's supposed to be hard.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be easy.
It is.
Otherwise, everyone would do it.
That's right, and already a lot more people are doing it than they were before.
Is it everything that you thought it would be, coming out of honours and applying now 3 years in? Is that?
I think it's more difficult than you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
I think. Just with, undergrad, I don't think it prepares you very well
for research.
For postgraduate research at all. It's completely different. You're not writing a 2,000-word essay.
And doing assignments.
And doing assignments. You have to manage a whole project and you have to connect everything together. And I don't know how well they prepare you for that sometimes in undergrad. I got closer with honours, but even honours is a different kettle of fish to doing your PhD.
100%.
So, I think it's been a little bit more tricky, but also I found some things that I didn't think I was going to find through doing the interviews, so that's been great.
No, awesome. Yeah. And, we've talked a lot about your education history, all of that in the past, but kind of rounding back to it, what does education mean to you?
Well, I think education is really important to, get just a better understanding of the world around you, also to kind of expand your opportunities for what you can do in the future too, because a lot of people aren't provided with a good education or don't have the opportunity to, learn those vital things in school and feel good about themselves and their schoolwork. So, I think education is really important. This is for a society, for everyone to get an education, have equal opportunities in their education too. and to learn those vital things as well as just expand their learning and not think about it just as, with higher education too, as a way of getting money or linking it to employment straight away too. Like we got to learn about these interesting things like linguistics, history units. Don't just get rid of them because they're not making enough money. They're not linked to industry as much. So yeah, not an instrumental approach to education. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sounds like the right way to do it.
I really like what you said about equal opportunity and expanding your learning.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm generally quite a curious person. There's so many things I want to know, but it's just I don't have time to go and look into every nook and cranny.
Yeah.
So, which is why I've kind of enjoyed doing the podcast and getting to meet people like yourself and others where we can learn through them and hear their perspectives as well. So, I mean, in a way, this podcast is also a part of my education as well. So, interesting. Would you agree, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. And it's spreading awareness of those the issues and problems that we're facing as a society that we may not be 100% aware of. And I think being like even just here, while we're involved in research, we're also part of a society. And I haven't considered perhaps some of the issues that have arisen in dyslexia
so
and
we're
development.
learning from Thom. Yeah,
definitely.
And I think education as well, it doesn't have to be like you said higher education or uni or TAFE, you opening up a book and reading. It can be things like listening to a podcast, watching a YouTube video. Like we're so lucky now to be surrounded by so much technology that education can happen through a lot of other ways than because some people don't read and they don't want to read.
A lot of people don't read.
Yeah, so you can always learn other ways.
Yeah, that's right, you can.
Information has never been more accessible.
That's it.
It comes down to...
Has its pros and its cons.
That's it. Oh, that's another story, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
All right.
So Tom, thank you for the time spent on telling us about your education, your background. Can you tell us a bit more about your project? What's it been like up to now?
Yeah, thanks. So I started out February 2019, I think it was, and I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do. So it kind of led on from my honours. So I wanted to interview more young people and their parents as well, because I didn't get to interview parents as part of the honours research. So I went about designing the project and was particularly interested in what the participants' experiences can tell us about the impact of education policies. So there was a couple of key educational policies I was interested in looking at. So there's the disability standards for education, and they outline the sorts of support that students should be provided with and must be provided with in schools. So they use this term called reasonable adjustments, which means any kind of support that you can introduce, which will mean a student with a disability can access a test or succeed or engage in their schooling on the same level as someone that wouldn't have the same difficulties as that student. So with dyslexia, the most famous one, and often the only one that's provided, is extra time. So that means that they're provided with an extra 10 minutes per hour of an assessment. So because of the processing difficulties as well as it taking a little bit longer to get their ideas out, that can be really useful. But it's not also only about extra time. There's other things like getting people to read questions to you using assistive tech like writing on your computer and also voice to text. So all those sorts of things. So I was interested in looking at particularly about, are they actually implementing these reasonable adjustments in schools? What sort of reasonable adjustments are they introducing and what impact does that have? And I was also interested in looking at parental engagement. So seeing if parents engage with the schools and if they are involved in designing and implementing support, and to what extent and what issues do they encounter in that process. So all these ideas were kind of bubbling away in my head, and I was taking kind of an interpretive approach, which means that you have this kind of general overarching questions and then more things emerge over the course of the research project. So I started off with writing a review article and then doing a policy paper, which is focused on analysing the policies. And then from there, I wrote my ethics application. So I spent a long time writing the ethics application, and you write it after you get your thesis. What do you call it?
The proposal?
Yeah, so
what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, what you're going to do. So I got my ethics in, and they raised some valid points about the project, but then they were also raising random points about methods and theory and aims and objectives that the ethics board isn't supposed to comment on. They're supposed to only comment on the ethical aspects of the research. So that was quite frustrating because they weren't doing their job necessarily as an ethics board. This isn't to mention that people were taking much longer than they should to return ethics revisions.
How long did it take you to get ethics, Tom?
Months. 6
Because
months.
obviously you couldn't start until
you can't start until you get ethics. So that was a problem. Also, like, my supervisor told me that it had been submitted in the system and it hadn't for a month. So that was also quite frustrating. But I got it accepted. So it wasn't a problem in the end. And I had already started a little bit recruiting, just casually, not any official recruiting UWA ethics.
Kind of just putting feelers out there.
Just putting feelers out there. So I ended up recruiting, say, 20 families. And then the whole kind of aim of the project was to interview them once a school term. So to get an understanding of their changes and their experiences. So, how did the relationship with teachers change over time? Are they provided with some support at some points in the school year and not others? How do they experience this key testing? So like NAPLAN and this new one, OLMA, which they have to pass it in order to get your leaving certificate for end of year 12. So I was interested in tracking all these changes over the course of the year and also just getting a more in-depth insight into participants' experiences through interviewing them all those times. So ended up doing probably 100 interviews over the course of the research project.
Interesting.
And that was great. Yeah.
And what have you found so far are some key interesting things that you've shared amongst these students and parents and things?
So there's quite a lot of difference between the schools. So a kid could be going to one school and they'd be being provided with all the support, and then you go to another school and it's completely different. Like they're not getting provided with any reasonable adjustments.
And is that related to the social class that you mentioned? So if they're from a low socioeconomic, middle,
Yeah,
or
well,
high?
it's an interesting one actually, because now this is only based on a small sample size, so we can't make any generalizations.
Spoken like a true scientist.
But I had a couple of participants from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were actually going to some of the more supportive schools than what you would think. Now that could just be luck of the draw, too, but it might be that some of these more prestigious, high-achieving schools that some of the upper middle-class families were going to might not be as accepting as these other schools, or want these kids to reach these really high standards, and when they don't, then it's not great. Like, for example, one of the participants went to this quite high-achieving independent public school in Perth, and she was talking to the principal before she sent her daughter there, and the principal said, "We've never had a dyslexic student at the school before. Those sorts of kids don't go here." And she ended up going to that school, and it's been a bit of a mixed bag. It's changed from year to year with how supportive they are. But there is still this sense, that, schools for these academic kids, if you're not reaching these really high,
they kind of brush you off.
They brush you off.
Take the time to nurture you, and
yeah.
You know what they say: the higher you go, the further you fall. So,
Yeah, so that was interesting. And then I suppose another one was with the adjustments that you can be provided with, and how there's these guidelines in year 12 that set limits on what sort of adjustments that you can be provided with when you want to go on to year 10, 11 and 12 and do your WACE. And these adjustments outline that you're only allowed to use extra time if you're dyslexic. So a lot of the kids, they find extra time useful, but it's not the only form of support they're given. So they could be using these assistive texts, they could be using computers and the like, and they can also get people to read out questions to them. And they find that really useful. And when they're given that support, they can go well. Okay. They have equal opportunity and access to the tests. But then they get to year 10, 11 and 12, and all of a sudden you get that support taken off you. And even before those rules come into play, so those rules only come into play in year 10, schools were already using those rules as kind of like a discourse. So you shouldn't be using a reader now because you're not going to get that in year 10, 11 and 12. And they're saying this to year 8s, right? So it's kind of an excuse not to provide the support. But one of the more complicated aspects of it too is that dyslexia is not covered for individual funding in Western Australia. So what that means is that if you have another disability, so if you have autism, for instance, so if you're a student with autism, you get individual funding and the school can use that funding to hire educational assistants, for example, to help these kids in the classroom. But if you're dyslexic, they put the funding to this big pool that they can use to support all the kids with ADHD, other learning disabilities, right? So the school gets to choose how they spend this money in the way that they want, right?
Yeah.
And it's often the case that I think when they say that you can't have things like readers or you can't have this assistive tech, it's linked back to this issue of funding, right? Because they don't have the funding to hire the EA just to help you in that particular test or to buy this assistive technology. So that was interesting in looking at how this discourse for year 10 and year 11 and 12 coming into play to impact students' experiences early on in their schooling.
Do you guys think also that the perception of other students on certain students with dyslexia, for example, having extra time or assistive tech, at that age you're not really understanding too well. Is there a negative perception of others? Like, oh, why do they get extra time?
Yeah, that's true.
You know, bullying comes into play and, you know, some of them probably don't want to then speak up about it.
Great question, yeah. There's a lot of stigma at some schools, not everyone, associated with using the extra time. You know, when you're a teenager, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to stick out. And when you use these kinds of support, depending on how they implement it, and I guess different types of support have more stigma associated than with others. So, for example, there's this pen that you can use called a C pen that reads out the questions to you. And you wear these headphones and it reads it out. And a lot of the participants were very anxious and not wanting to use that support because they didn't want to be bullied because of it. So that perception of, you know, looking different is not great for these kids. But there's also, as you said, that idea that it's an advantage, right? That you're getting provided with this support, that you're being unfairly advantaged. You're equaling the playing field too much for these kids. But that seems to be the focus, you know, not equalizing it too much.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's this other issue going on here that they're not necessarily seeing the support as being vital to kids being able to access education. It's not giving them an advantage. It's something that's critical to them being able to progress through their education. And this whole process that kids have to go through to be how they're eligible to be provided with this support later in their education, it kind of reinforces that idea as an advantage. You're like you're guilty until proven innocent, so to speak. Because,
there's a massive difference as well between equality and equity, which, you know, I'm sure you've seen those memes circulating of two kids trying to look over a fence at something on the other side, and equality is giving them the exact same step to step on, but perhaps one kid is shorter than the other, and equity is making sure that the shorter kid has maybe 2 steps so they can actually see over the fence, which kind of, so it's a very important concept for sure.
There's all different sorts of ways of thinking about social justice and equity, and for my project I'm using this approach called the capabilities approach. And in the capabilities approach, equality is defined in terms of the opportunities that people have to do and be things that contribute to their well-being. So it's not looking about distribution of resources and distributing them in the same way. So that would be, you know, people standing on the same step. It's these resources are distributed equally when these people can reach what they want to do and achieve that well-being and achieve these key functionings. So literacy and all those sorts of things. So if you evaluate that on that basis, you give these kids as much resources and you treat them as respectively as possible so that they can reach those key functionings and capabilities.
Now I want to go back to the adjustments that you were talking about earlier, Tom, because I've been doing some teaching at university for a few years now, and I know where I teach, students can apply for something called an access plan. So they go and see someone and they give them all these details, and then they are then able to get extra time for assessments, or depending on what they have, you know, they could have some other types of assistive technology and things like that. So for me to hear then that, you know, when they're in year 10, 11, 12, that they kind of don't maybe aren't given consideration for that kind of thing. I find it quite interesting because I have seen students take up extra time and things like that they need to. They're a little bit more supported.
Yeah, different settings, like tertiary settings, and TAFE in particular, I found, seems to be really supportive. So one of my participants dropped out of ATAR because he wasn't sure if he was going to get extra time. And the family was actually going to the Human Rights Commission to make a complaint to the education department, because his whole argument was that he needed as much extra time as he could use to be able to show the full extent of his knowledge. And they were saying that you can't have as much extra time as you want. You only need 10 minutes. That's the rule. You have to get 10 minutes. But it's not based on any evidence.
Yeah, right.
So that was a problem. But when he went to TAFE, extra time, no problem. Use it. Use your computer to do everything. Use voice to text. So it seems like in these different settings, so in TAFE and higher education, there is more support, particularly, for these kids with dyslexia and other difficulties. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think also it comes from the fact that now when you're at TAFE and you're at university, the focus on freedom and independence is a lot more, and people are okay with that. Whereas in school, I feel like you have to fit within a certain box. You have to be under this control. You can't really do what you want to when you want to. You go to school at this time, you come back at this time, you have maths at this time and English. Like, it's just so restrictive.
It's not very flexible.
Not at all, no.
And it's interesting with policies, you see this idea of personalization, right? So really catering to the individual in their learning. But in the same policy, you'll see personalization and then making things really systematic, making everyone do the same sort of testing, standardized. So these clashing forces of standardization and personalization, which one's winning out?
Yeah.
Well, it's pretty clear that standardization is. And this is the argument, that these things like extra time, assistive tech, they're not fixing the problem. It's kind of like a sticky tape over the problem in the system, right? Yeah. So you're letting people into a system that's been unchanged. And the argument is that you can't do that. It's not going to be consistently inclusive across the whole school system. So what you need to do is change that system, make that system different so that from the very beginning, it's accessible and inclusive of the most amount of people possible. Yeah.
And the truth is, more and more we're finding out we don't fit into the same boxes, We all need different things to succeed. So sounds like hopefully things change, especially with your contribution as well to this field, and moving forward in the next few years, I think there will be hopefully some big changes. Yeah,
hopefully. And there are schools out there that are quite supportive. A couple of the participant schools have been great, introducing that support that they need. Teachers not necessarily have a great understanding of dyslexia, but they're not putting the kids down. And that really shows that, the impact of things like dyslexia are very context dependent and relational. So depending on your relationships with teachers and the support that's available to you, because you can succeed like anyone else if you're dyslexic. You just need those same conditions, those good conditions.
Speaking of Tom, did you ever consider interviewing teachers with dyslexic students?
I wanted to.
Could be a future work.
Yeah, future work for sure.
That would be an interesting
bit of debate during the research design phase about if we should include teachers or not.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with that would be the education department, and their ethics process is quite difficult. Like it will last a year to get ethics clearance, and they don't want people to be critical of them, right? So it's quite hard to word it in a way that you'll get accepted. Yeah. But definitely something in the future I want to talk to
watch
teachers.
This space.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned interviewing the participants, but how have the parents, from the parents' point of view, what's that been like?
Parents tend to be more stressed out and anxious than the kids do. For example, there was this one mum who's been advocating for her daughter really hard, and that's another thing. Parents advocate for their kids. And nearly all of the participants' experiences, if it wasn't for the parents and their consistent advocacy, they probably wouldn't have been provided with any support. So parents are really important, and them feeling comfortable to advocate for their kids in schools is really important. And most of the parents do feel comfortable, and that might be because they're from these middle class and upper middle class backgrounds. They have that kind of, in complicated sociological terms, the habitus of the middle classes, right?
Yeah.
So they've been to school, they tend to go well in school, they see themselves as equals to teachers, and they feel like they can challenge teachers because they've got higher education degrees themselves, right? People from low socioeconomic backgrounds might not have gone as far through their education as these other parents, might have a different attitude towards parenting, so have more trust in the school's just going to do what they're supposed to do. That would impact on the advocacy too. But yeah, so parents, consistent advocacy, stressed out about it a lot of the time, about how their kids are going to go throughout the year. You know, a number of the parents that I talked to in the last interview that we did in term 4 were seriously thinking about moving schools. So I had one participant who moved their daughter's schools. I had a second participant who was pretty much certain that she was going to. And moving your kid to a different school was quite a difficult thing because they have those social ties, they have friends. You don't know for sure if that school is going to be more supportive.
Yeah.
They might seem like they have their understanding of dyslexia, but do they once you're there? So all these things are kind of bubbling away in their heads to the parents, and they just have to make the best decision that they think they can make and send their kids to a different school. So yeah, I've been in touch earlier this year, just sending out some emails halfway through the term just to see how they're going, and yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah, right.
And that's going to be complicated for the student as well, like going through that move and change. They've probably just gotten used to the surroundings maybe a bit more, but then the change again probably makes them feel like more of a special case, I guess, that needs.
Yeah.
So it's going to be some challenges there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got to think about, because, you know, with the research, it's the parents' point of view, but it's also the students, right? So balancing those two things. But yeah, I think sometimes the kids just want to go to a new school. And in other instances, I don't think the kids were aware that their parents were even thinking about moving them to a different school in the first place. So that's something for them to manage. Because as a researcher, you kind of have to balance your relationship with the participants, and you can't be too involved with those sorts of decisions. So you hear a lot about their lives and their experiences, but you've also got to kind of like step back and not get too invested.
Well, have you thought about this? Yeah, you can't really do that, can you?
No.
And obviously, so I talk a lot about recruiting patients for my study, and you've obviously recruited participants for your study. I want to know what that experience has been like for you, recruiting these families and, you know, going back to see them every term. Has that been difficult? Or
it hasn't been too bad. Recruiting was a bit of a challenge. Just getting the people to start, because you're always worried, am I not going to get enough participants? Are they going to meet?
Gee, I wonder what that's like.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did you find these people anyway?
I messaged this dyslexia information board. So all these parents use it. They post stuff on it, asking questions, sharing their experiences. So I got most of them through that Facebook page. And then I also got participants through contacting psychologists, psychological organizations, as well as different support groups. So support groups in the southwest, because I wanted to get some participants living in rural or not metro areas. So I posted on those pages.
Yeah, because I remember we went to Dunsborough. This was March last year before all the lockdown, and you had to stop over at one point for an interview with a participant.
Yeah.
So I thought that fit into the itinerary quite nicely.
Yeah, that's right. That's part of the trip. And actually last year too, probably in September, I used some of my research funds to go down south, and it was a very difficult trip full of interviewing and drinking wine.
Nice.
And eating food and going on walks. So that was
your
fun.
PhD experience has been quite interesting as well then.
Yeah, so that was good, going and interviewing people in their homes.
And getting UWA to pay for it.
And getting them to pay for part of it. But that's another thing, you know, this isn't ethics, but this was getting travel approval from the university. And you had to do this hazards test with driving. And one of them was, you have to write down that you're driving not late in the afternoon because the sun would be in the direction of your eyes. And then you have to be careful when you're cooking because you don't want to burn yourself. So you have to put
all
an
these risk
emergency plan.
assessments.
So like, this is bullshit. Like, do you really need that much information in them? But
no, I feel like universities want to cover themselves as much as possible, don't they?
Yeah.
So was 20 the magic number in terms of your sample size?
Initially,
20 families?
I wanted 18. And I wanted an equal distribution of families from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and 6 families in regional remote areas. And in the end, I probably got 3. from non-middle class background, and then all the rest were from middle class backgrounds, and then I ended up getting 6 in regional and rural areas. So
It's pretty good.
yeah, it was pretty good. It was just hard recruiting people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and I think part of that was the cost of diagnosis being a prohibited factor. So diagnosis of dyslexia costs $1,100.
Wow.
And before getting that diagnosis, you need to have interventions. So that just means extra literacy support, like one-on-one. But if the school's not providing that one-on-one support, then you have to go and get it privately, right?
Yeah.
So that's more money. And then another thing is you have to get a diagnosis again in year 10 just to see if you're still dyslexic. So that's more money. Not as much as the $1,000. But you can see that all these things, how much money you have to pay.
Yeah, adds up.
Mainly, adds up, as well as private support. A lot of people aren't going to be able to pay for a diagnosis, so that might be part of why I wasn't able to recruit more families from those backgrounds.
Definitely. And on top of that as well, maybe the, like you mentioned, parents advocating for their child is very important, but of course there are parents who maybe aren't as good as advocating, or just
they can't.
They're busy, or the mindset as well that, my child's just slow, they'll eventually catch up with
Yeah.
extra this and that. So there's also so many things that go into it.
All these factors, and there's this famous like sociological theory of reproduction where it's the culture of the middle classes, which is embedded in schools, and they're advantaged because of that. But if your culture isn't celebrated, embedded in the way that school works, practices, then you're going to be disadvantaged. And the whole kind of thinking that I was having is that if you're from a low socioeconomic background and you're dyslexic, you're twice as disadvantaged as a result of that. Yeah.
Alrighty, so obviously when you're interviewing all these people, Tom, you've got to then put it all together.
Yep.
And one of the ways you do that is by transcribing everything that they've said in the interview.
Yeah, everything.
Word for word.
Word for word.
And
every interview, all 100 of them.
Obviously, you don't listen to them and write it out yourself. There's obviously a program or something that you use.
Yeah, I use Otter AI. So
I've heard of Otter. Yeah.
you give them a recording and then use artificial intelligence to put it into sentence structure. And
Did you have to pay for that?
yes, $5 a month.
Is
That's
it?
not too bad.
Yeah. Unlimited?
It's unlimited. Oh, like a certain amount of hours actually. How many was it? 5,000.
Okay.
How do you find it? Is it accurate enough? Do you have to...
Yeah, is it good?
Oh, it's not too accurate. So sorry, Otter.
No.
You won't be sponsoring this podcast. We won't be sending no ads, but yeah, it's reasonably accurate. It depends on the quality of the transcription. It also depends on the person who's talking. Some are speak more clearly than others, but I'll still spend like 3 hours on the interview
Editing
it and putting it into structure. T for Tom, P for participant.
Yeah. At least most of it would have been done, and you just kind of have to go through and listen to it and make sure it's okay.
Yeah, and often it's not right, like the words aren't right,
Yeah.
but it would definitely be more time. It's
Do
more
you
time
think-
effective than just transcribing it by yourself. Like
Yeah,
100% is better, but it could be a better program.
Do you think as well with our accent, like the Aussie accent sometimes as well?
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
the way we say things are just so different to how it's spelled.
Yeah.
Like water.
Yeah, the Aussie accent, it can be difficult. Some people speak really clearly and it's perfect. It's like, I can do hardly anything. But then other people are like, oh, so much editing. But, it's good doing transcription because it means you're not writing the whole time.
Yeah.
You can break it up and do different things.
Yeah. It gets tedious though. Like I have to, I tried transcription, like transcribing some of the podcasts, especially the early episodes. And yeah, it's not fun. So
No, it's not fun. It's a bit mind-numbing.
it is.
But
Yeah.
sometimes you need something like that. Like in the last 2 hours of a day. It's like, oh, I don't want to write. I don't want to read.
At least you're still being productive.
I'll transcribe.
Yeah.
I'm still doing something.
So what happens after you transcribe? Is there then, like for Ben and I, we have to do data analysis and things like that. Do you have to do anything like that?
Yeah, so I do data analysis, but it's a bit different from
What
type
we
of
probably
data
do.
analysis that you guys do. So there's no like statistics or anything like that. I get these codes. So, a kid talks about a teacher who's not great, negative experience with teacher. Every time they referenced a reasonable adjustment, so extra time, use of the computer, then I'll put reasonable adjustment. If I notice something like there's a factor that influences whether or not they can use that support in a way that benefits them, I'll use conversion factors, right? So once I've done all of that, I'll print them out. This is the way I like doing it. And then I'll look at it and I'll try to get themes linked to those particular codes. So different conversion factors would be, depending on the teacher, which means different teachers provide different types of support. Whether or not they're going to get extra time depends on the classroom teacher. And then looking at that, I look at all those themes and think, oh yeah, that would be an interesting topic for a paper. And then I base it on that. So that's one part of the data analysis. The other part is writing these interpretive narratives of the participants' experiences throughout the year. So, key events in term 1, key events in term 2, and then including quotes in that. So getting a real good understanding of the participants' experiences throughout the whole year. And I think that's important because sometimes in papers when you just randomly quote individual quotes, it kind of gets decontextualized, disassociated from the individual. So something that was important for me was to do this analysis and get these wider themes from the research, but to always be able to tie it back to that individual's experience throughout the year, which I think is really important. Yeah.
Wow.
Definitely.
Wow.
No, that sounds amazing, Tom. So you're probably in that process now and writing up some of these themes and papers.
Yep.
Obviously when all this is over, what's the plan for you after your PhD in the next few years?
Well, I would like to keep on going in research, so continue on with this topic. I'll do something else, so maybe get a postdoc position, which is easier said than done.
Especially in Perth, where we are.
Especially in Perth, or to get some sort of grant with my supervisors or something like that. Things aren't looking great for the social sciences at the moment. A lot of staff are being cut from UWA. So it's a difficult time, particularly with COVID too, and how that's impacted universities because they're not funded by the government properly.
Yeah.
It's a difficult time to come out of doing a PhD.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of in that boat going,
aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, it's not the end of the world if I don't continue on in academia after this, and now I'd be open to looking into job opportunities at the education department.
Policy, maybe?
Policy, exactly. And also just access.
Yeah.
So maybe uni access would be an area that I would be interested in looking at.
Give support to the students on the ground.
Give support to students on the ground, make some changes to that whole system. But, it's near the end of the PhD, so you have to start thinking about jobs.
Yeah, you do.
Don't you? So you got those two things of, I've got to finish this.
Yeah.
And then, what am I going to do afterwards? So we'll see how we go.
It always kind of, once you start something, it always goes to, okay, what now? What's next? What do I do?
Yeah.
It's in all stages of life.
And it'll be weird finishing it.
It will be, but at the same time, I'm sure all of us can't wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking forward to finishing it. There'll be a weird feeling, I think.
It would be. So we're going to then, thank you so much, Tom, for sharing some of your research, which is obviously a lot different to what Ben and I do, so it's good to have a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going to wrap up the episode with something that I've been seeing circulating around the internet, and I thought it would be interesting to discuss. So the way that we think, obviously, we were just talking about this earlier, could have an impact on the way that we study and the way that we learn. So, do you think in words or in pictures?
Yeah, I think in words, and fairly chaotically. Things are moving around pretty quickly. I think that's part of dyslexia and dysgraphia too. So you're thinking in words, you've got all these ideas in your head, but then you have to put them on the computer, onto paper. So that's when I like putting in more visually, like linking up, drawing arrows everywhere.
Like a mind map situation?
More like a mind map. Yeah, like chunking things, moving them around.
Yeah.
I wish I could have like a monitor and I could use my hands and I could be like I'm gonna move this sentence here, and then it doesn't work.
Get
I'm
an
gonna click
iPad.
it back. So maybe, obviously, just technology is already out there, so maybe I should actually use it. But
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people are shocked. So a lot of people recently have found out through posts circulating in the internet that a lot of people don't have this verbal internal monologue in their heads of their own voices talking to them and thinking and telling them what to do, which is something that I think I do a lot. I talk to myself, or I have my own voice in my head.
yeah,
But a lot of other people then don't have that internal monologue, and they actually have these abstract, non-verbal thoughts and feelings and ideas, and they see pictures and colours, and it's just, it amazes me because I don't think I do that a lot of the time. But also sometimes it depends on what I'm doing. I see a sequence of images. If I'm going to be doing, okay, I'm going to drive to work, and then I'm going to head to my other job site, and then I'm going to do this, and then I can kind of imagine myself driving. But then it'll always be accompanied by this voiceover. So I can relate to what you said about those thoughts and ideas in your head, which is sometimes hard to sort.
yeah.
So you're the same. What about you, Ben?
I think I'm a bit of both. Like, thinking back to undergrad, I think I've always learned better when I've drawn out the mind map. If I've drawn out a molecular mechanism, because I've come from that background, I think I've learned that better than if I've come across a question or something where I've had to regurgitate that information. I've always sort of imagined rather that graphical representation rather than, say, the words just with arrows pointing to each other. But you just reflect, here you reflect, and you're the main character in your story.
Of course.
I think that I can't say I don't experience that, because I do 100%, and I think, how do they respond to that? What happens if you say that? I guess I'm overanalyzing that in that way as well. So
that's when you have that voiceover.
Yeah.
Whereas most of the time it's quite visual.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting, and it also ties to the way that you learn. I'm quite visual and practical as well. I like when people show me how to do things.
Yeah.
And then I can imagine myself doing it as well.
Yeah, people like throwing around all these things about dyslexia, like they don't have any internal monologues, or like one participant, a mum said to me, you know dyslexics are colourblind? And I said, oh yeah, really?
That is
like, no.
That's
So there's all these things that people chuck around, and like, I think that in general with the participants, they tend to prefer visual and spatial learning.
Yeah, definitely.
So having things in the board that they can look at, doing it practically because of issues with following instructions. Like I remember when I was soccer training, and they'll say you have to do these 5 steps in a row. I'll be like, well, I can't remember.
Yeah.
So you always need someone to kind of like show you how to do it physically, even like with learning how to play tennis. Physically showing you how to do the shot. Because you can't really get it with just the verbal information, I guess.
No, because you can't then visualize yourself, cue it up to do it in your head.
Yeah.
So interesting. And I think it kind of goes towards the study of anthropology, social science, psychology. There's so much that we don't know about dyslexia, how the brain works, how we learn, which is why it's so interesting to do so much more research in this field.
And combine it together. I don't want to be too critical of the psychological sciences, because they hold a role, obviously, in understanding dyslexia moving forward, but all these things are interacting with each other, your brain, cognitive biology interacts with your social environment. You can't understand a kid's experiences by just doing brain scans, but at the same time, you can't completely understand the difficulties that kids face by just looking at social factors. So definitely moving forward in research, there's got to be more of a balance between the two, so that we can understand both sides of the equations, both the social and the psychological.
Thank you so much, Thom, for coming on the show. I think this is a good place to wrap up. 2% battery.
2% battery. It's going to go soon.
I have to admit that I've learned a lot about your project and what dyslexia means in general, and the impacts as well. So it's a lot. I'm definitely going to be, as a teacher as well, I'm going to be a bit more, try and be a bit more supportive of students. And so thank you. And it'll be a good place for our listeners to reflect as well. How do you guys think in pictures or words? Voice in your head.
Yep.
Let us know down below if you're on Instagram or send us a DM. Thanks again for your time, Thom.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed talking about my experiences. It's good to talk to other PhD students too.
Yeah, definitely.
Just to hear how they're going and how their projects are progressing. Yeah.
Lots of shared experiences.
That's right.
I love hearing the different fields as well. So if any of you listeners are PhD students and would like to I don't know, come on the show, share your experiences,
You should
tell your tale.
get someone in from like astronomy or.
Oh, that would be cool.
Or maybe.
I have many questions on astronomy. I'm a big
right.
space nerd.
This is
Well,
right.
like, what about historical studies? I'm a big ancient Egypt gal as well.
Oh yeah, that would be pretty good.
Hit us up, slide into our DMs.
Yeah.
All right, thanks guys for listening, and thank you, Thom. If you'd like to chat with Thom or have any questions for him, send us an email and we will get it to him.
Yeah.
And he'll answer for you.
I will.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in. To make sure you don't miss out on our structured rambling, follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at So You Think You Can PhD.
You can also check out our website on Podpage and Anchor FM. Please rate and review the show, let us know your feedback, and if there's anything you'd like to hear on a future episode.
Or even just to say hey, we'd love to hear from you.
No. Serious inquiries only, please.
Thanks again.
Bye.